Hello and welcome. I'm Paul Estro. Behind the camera is Amy, running around and inevitably hitting the camera, making it go like that would be Roxy the house cat. Welcome from the Halsey Valley Victory House. We are looking at John chapter 19 tonight. And if you remember, John started his gospel right in the beginning, just thinking of Genesis, right? And the garden, and there we go. And nice job, Roxy. So think of John talking about Genesis, right? And Exodus, leading his people out to the promised land. And we see the Passover, right? Jesus coming as the Passover lamb. So all this is coming to fruition right here in John chapter 19. John closing up his arguments of Jesus being God, God coming to save his creation. So Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and threw a purple robe around him. And they repeatedly came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him outside to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." Now wait a minute, he's innocent? You find no grounds for charging him, but you just had him flogged. Really? Wow. He's thinking, if I flog him, yeah, that should appease the Jews. I send this bloody man back to them. Now, see, the Jews had this, you would get 39 lashes with the Jews. They were allowed by law to do 40, but in case they miscounted, they always did 39. Romans didn't believe in any of that. It might be 40 or, 100, whatever. So here's Jesus, been beaten and flogged and mocked. And it says a purple robe was thrown around him. Now, if we look at the other Gospels, Luke's Gospel, we'll see that Pilate sent Jesus over to Herod, right? And we talked last time about, the politics that's going on here. And you've got Herod in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. So he made his home elsewhere, so he wasn't in the city, but he comes into the city now for the Passover. So Herod sends him over, sends Jesus over to Herod, I should say. So you deal with him. And Pilate and Herod didn't get along, right? Because, Herod would squeal back to Pilate's boss, back to Caesar, everything that was going on. And, of course, Pilate didn't want to have to deal with the temple people and then the king of the Jews. And it's just, as we said earlier, very, very confusing. And so, but Herod was excited to see Jesus, thinking he'd get some miracle or something out of him. And when Jesus wouldn't do parlor tricks for him, he put a purple robe on him and sent him back, kind of mocking Jesus. And Herod thought that was funny, and that gospel tells us that. From then on, Herod and Pilate became friends. So it's interesting, take the time to go through and see how these stories stack up. And so we get to verse 5. And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Right? Very cynical, and the man looking ridiculous, bloodied and beaten with this crown of thorns on his head and this purple robe on him. And of course we think back to Genesis, right? We think of the garden. And when Adam fell, God said, "Now the ground will produce thorns and thistles." And now the earthly creatures of the earth are putting a crown of thorns on God's head, laughing as he's being mocked here. So it's a very powerful statement, right? Pilate showing his authority, the Jews laughing with their authority, and of course Herod in the background setting some of this up. And so really a lot to think about when we get into it. So when the chief priests, now think about this, the chief priests, the leaders of the temple, the temple police saw Jesus like this, they start shouting, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, for I find no grounds for charging him." More contempt from Pilate. He knows the Jews can't by law crucify anyone, and if they do, then he would step in and crucify them. So he says, go ahead, do it yourself. He's had it up to here with the whole thing. On one hand, but not doing his job on the other. "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to the law, he must die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever, and he went back into the headquarters and he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "You're not talking to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you?" You can almost see the mafia movies being played out here, right? And Jesus says, "You'd have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given to you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Remember, think back, he said their sin still exists because they didn't believe Jesus came from God. They didn't want to believe the truth that was right before their eyes. But from that moment on, Pilate made every effort to release him. See, Pilate just, again, is kind of wishy-washy, but stuck in the middle. And they go, "If you're not Caesar's friend, you're not Caesar's friend. Really, if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." We see earlier why Pilate was so afraid. Caesar is Lord, and we have to understand this, right? The currency back then said Caesar is Lord. So if you're declaring Jesus is Lord, that means Caesar isn't. That did not go over well. And all Pilate needs is to have Herod or one of his weasels go back to Caesar and say, "There was somebody claiming to be your son, to be equal with you, Caesar," and Pilate let him go. Can you believe that? Right? This is how this politics plays out. So Pilate's like, okay, But he does have the authority to let him go. He could just say, this guy's a nut job. We're going to let you go, let him go. Or, "I flogged him. What more do you want?" But again, he's playing politics. And of course, behind this, we have Satan and God, God who's truly in control, and it's going to go down this way. So anyway, when Pilate hears these words, he brought Jesus outside, and he sat down on the judge's bench in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover. It was about 6 in the morning. And he told the Jews, "Here's your king." But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" Pilate says to them, "Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar." Talk about blasphemy. These are the head of the temple. Right? The ones looking out, the one in charge of the temple, looking out for God's kingdom on earth here. "We don't have a king except Caesar." Amy's over there holding the cat, shaking her head. This is an incredible thing that's going down here. So then, because of them, he handed him over to be crucified. So they get their wish. Remember, the high priest said better one man should die than, the whole place have to suffer for what he's attempting to do here. So therefore, they take Jesus away. Verse 17 says, carrying his own cross, he went out to what is called Skull Place, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. Now, Luke tells us that along the way, Jesus is so weak, he can't carry his cross. And so they grab Simon the Cyrene to pick up his cross and carry it for a while. And we learn later on in Scripture that his kids seem to be very, very prominent in the church. But quite a moment that goes on there. But John is not focused on that. He's focused on Jesus getting to the cross. And there they crucified him with two others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Remember, we had talked earlier about where John and James's mother, actually in Scripture it's always James and John, which makes James seem to be the older one, which we'll get to in a minute, but James and John's mother brings him up to Jesus and says, my boys want to be on your left and your right in your kingdom. And Jesus says, well, that place is reserved for other people. I wonder if he was talking about this here. And then Pilate also had a sign lettered and put on the cross, and the inscription read, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. And they always, or at least usually, put a sign over the crucified body so all passers-by could see what they had done and what it got them. It was quite a deterrent to stop others from doing such things, because thousands and thousands of people were crucified under the Romans. Many of the Jews read this sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Probably Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, but the three main languages of the day. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, don't write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. He's not the king, really, they're saying. Pilate replied, what I have written, I have written. Now, get out of here. It's been a long morning dealing with you people. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, then they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier. They also took the tunic, which was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but we'll toss for it. See who gets it. They did this to fulfill the scripture that says, they divided my clothes among themselves, and they cast lots for my clothing. And this is what the soldiers did. We're going to talk a little bit about these soldiers in a minute. What a dirty job. Talk about heartless, very cruel people, and they get very, callous to the whole thing, I'm sure. But Psalm 22, I would encourage you to spend a lot of time in this season on Psalm 22. We spend a lot of time on Psalm 23, but Psalm 22 is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, and it speaks to what John is mentioning here. It's also what Jesus recites on the cross. So I encourage you to spend some time there. And standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and disciples he loved standing there, he said to his mother, woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciples, here is your mother. And from that hour on, the disciples took her into his home. Hey, Blood on the Nails, one of my favorite songs, one of my favorite authors. They have that 26 to 30. Probably should have been 25, but anyway. Yeah. Let's spend a little bit of time here on this. So we see that Jesus sees John there with the women. And he asked his mother, he asked John to take care of his mother. None of Jesus' brothers are there. None of the other disciples are there. Now, the Romans, had spies everywhere. They would be keeping a close eye out, seeing, who are his people. We're going to have more trouble with some of his people. So one of the common things a lot of theologians talk about is this idea that I say common things, the different streams of theologians all seem to confer that John was very young. And so if James was his older brother, here John, he's a young man, so maybe he doesn't even have a beard, right? There's a famous painting at the Last Supper. He doesn't seem to have a beard. And so he's very young, so just a boy hanging out with some women, maybe his mother, So he didn't really pose a threat. But Jesus gives his mother to his custody. Of course, after Jesus is resurrected, he appears to his brothers, and we see some of his brothers become major players in the church. But here we see John standing there watching this go down, and now John is currently writing this many years later. After this, when Jesus knew that everything was now accomplished. Remember, at the beginning he said, my time. Think about this. At the beginning of his ministry, his mother asked him to turn water into wine, right? Very beginning of the Gospel of John. And Jesus says, my time hasn't come yet. But he takes the water people wash their hands with and he turns it into really good wine. But after this, when Jesus knew that everything was now accomplished and that Scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I'm thirsty, and a jar full of sour wine was sitting there. So they fixed a sponge full of sour wine on hyssop and held it up to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. So he gave man the best wine. In return, we give him sour wine that finishes his work here on earth in his body. But notice he bows his head and he gives up his spirit. He says, no one takes my life from me. I pick it up, I lay it down. I do what I want with it. Now that it's finished, he gives up the ghost, as it were. Since it was the preparation day, the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a special day. They requested that Pilate have the men's legs broken and that their bodies be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and then of the other who had been crucified with Jesus. Remember, in the Gospels we see that one of the men hanging on the cross realizes who Jesus really is. Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. They break the legs. When you're hanging on that cross, you need to lift up in order to breathe. And it really, so it prolongs the agony. When you break their legs, they're no longer able to do that, and so they suffocate quicker. Horrible, no matter how you slice it. But when they came to Jesus, they did not break his legs, since they saw that he was already dead. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth. So they pierce Jesus' side, make sure he's dead, because you don't want to take somebody off the cross if they're not dead, because that would get you up there. So they pierce his side, and the water gathering in the body proves he's dead. And of course there's this, we think of the Old Testament where Jesus is the rock and living water comes out of the rock. Whether that's John's intention or not, could be. But Jesus is now dead. For these things had to happen so that Scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken, because he's the Passover lamb, and you can't break the bones of the Passover lamb. Also, the other Scripture that says, they will look on the one they pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took his body away. Now Nicodemus, who we met earlier in John's Gospel, who had previously come to him at night, also came, bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Then they took Jesus' body and wrapped it in a linen cloth with the aromatic spices according to the burial custom of the Jews. And there was a garden. Remember, we started in Genesis in the garden. There was a garden in that place where he was crucified. A new tomb was in the garden. No one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish preparation, and since the tomb was nearby. Next week we look at chapter 20, and that starts with, on the first day of the week, a new beginning. We're back in the garden. A new beginning has come. Anyway, I hope you take some time this week. Look at the other Gospels. Carefully read through this. Look at the stuff that comes up from Psalm 22. Psalm 69 is also in there. Anyway, so lots to pray and think about this week. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Check out my song Blood on the Nails if you haven't heard that. Would appreciate that very much. And until next time, stay safe and God bless.